Hey everybody, welcome to North Rock Church and welcome to our 21 days of prayer and fasting. Fasting. This week, as you probably already know, we are taking a break from media, taking a media fast. And that really works well with the scripture in John chapter 10 that we're going to look at today because we live in a crazy, noisy world. I don't think that it would be wrong for me to say that even an angry world, an arguing world, a divided world. But it's also just noisy and period. We got all kinds of devices. We're driving down the highway here in San Antonio or wherever you are, and we have billboards everywhere, advertising everything. It's just like a blur. If I was looking for something, it's hard to find because there's signs everywhere. And if we are close to people, we see people crying. We hear people crying. We hear people in anguish. We hear people laughing. We hear babies laughing. So we hear good and we hear bad, but it is a noisy world. And because of that, it makes it difficult to hear from our Creator, to really hear. And John chapter 10 is kind of a long chapter, so I'm not going to spend all my time in that whole, all those verses, but let's look. I want to read to you the first 6 verses. And if you'll let me, I just want to kind of walk through it, talk through it. John chapter 10, verses 1 to 6. Jesus is saying, I assure you, anyone who doesn't enter the sheep pen by the door but climbs in some other way is a thief and a robber. Well, that starts off pretty weird, right? Sheep pen. Who's interested in being a sheep in a sheep pen? What is a sheep pen? So let's just kind of go back to that day, that day when sheep were very important livestock in Jerusalem and around that area. Well, shepherds would bring their flock to what you would call a sheep pen, and they would hire a gatekeeper. And so you would go by the sheep pen, and there wouldn't be just one flock of sheep. There'd be 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm not sure. There could be many, many flocks of sheep that you would find all mingled together in this one large pen. And so Jesus is saying, the sheep, they're like us. That's us. That's who we represent. And then the shepherd represents shepherds, but of course he's going to talk about himself in just a little bit. So the first thing that he says is that there are people who try to climb over the fence to get into the pen. So unfortunately, that's still part of the noisy world, right? They're trying to woo you away from your shepherd. They're trying to distract you. So we'll continue on here in verse 2. The one who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. The doorkeeper opens it for him, and the sheep hear his voice. The doorkeeper is somebody that the shepherd pays to watch over the sheep, and the doorkeeper recognizes the shepherds who paid him to watch over the sheep. All right, so that's where we're at so far. The doorkeeper opens it for him, and the sheep hear his voice. I want you to remember that, hear his voice, because there's a different word that's going to be used here in just a minute to describe the uniqueness of the sheep and the shepherd. So the doorkeeper opens it for him, the shepherd, and the sheep hear his voice, hear the shepherd's voice. Here's how I kind of imagine that. So if Jesus is the shepherd, he walks in through the gate. He walks in among all of these sheep, and they're from all over the place. And he begins to recognize some of his sheep. He even has named some of them. So he would touch this one on the head. He would say, hey, Bonnie, whatever he calls these sheep, right? He just kind of, and so, everyone hears, all the sheep hear him, but not all the sheep recognize him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought all his own sheep outside, he goes ahead of them. So he starts making a way out of the pen. The sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. You see, there's sheep in the pen that are not going to follow because they don't recognize the voice of their shepherd. They will never follow a stranger. Instead, they will run away from him because they don't recognize the voice of strangers. And then Jesus ends this section. He says, Jesus gave them this illustration, but they did not understand what he was telling them. Here is what Jesus is telling us, that if we will listen, if we will quiet ourselves, if we'll calm down, take a break from all these things, we have the opportunity to remember that he, Jesus, is with us. He's with you. He's not just with you, but he's also helping you. And he's not just helping you, he's also guiding you. Something to contemplate today as you go through this week.